everybody. My name is Spencer Walsh. We have a good one for you as always. You are listening to a little bit late Friday edition of Newsflash and some absolutely historic news today. The ICJ rules that Israel must stop their Rafah operation. This comes on the heels of the ICC issuing arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and three Hamas leaders, as we talked about earlier in the week. A real sign that the international justice system is calling this out for what it is, which is a genocide, and really using the language of the Genocide Convention in there. It is a big step. It is a, in large part, symbolic step, but it could have some big implications. We'll give you all the latest on that. Also, the families of the horrific Uvalde shooting are doing more legal efforts, including against Call of Duty and the rifle maker, and also Instagram. All they say played a role in grooming this gunman to commit a really horrific massacre. Also, a really horrific story out of Gaza, why doctors have been disappearing from hospitals there en masse, disappearing into Israeli detention. Also, a kind of really under-the-radar story in the midst of all the craziness going on. It really is starting to look like Saudi Arabia did 9/11. With some new documents that have come out over the past week or so that were in the Atlantic, of all places, and they, really did not get that much attention. As I think it was not called first by me, but it's always a great name to call, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization magazine. Pretty much, you cannot get more U.S. friendly or, just empire friendly if you try. So that, it's a very, very significant thing to see something, related to our national security interests, so to speak, in the Atlantic. So we have to start with this. And this is in Al Jazeera here today. This is a pretty helpful explainer breaking down the really big notification, the big ruling from The Hague today. The International Court of Justice, not the International Criminal Court, has called on Israel to end its operation in Rafah, the southernmost town in Gaza. So this is the court that deals with countries. This is the court that is currently and recently ruled that there is a plausible case for genocide that Israel has been committing in the Gaza Strip. And they have also ruled today that they must stop their invasion in Rafah, the southernmost town in Gaza, and immediately open aid, and specifically the Kerem Abu Shalom crossing that they themselves, Israel, caused to close with their invasion, which the U.S. called was not apparently it wasn't a major operation in the U.S.'s eyes, but it still shut down pretty much the entire flow of aid from Egypt. So, pretty major in my book, but that is what they have just been called to stop by the ICJ. According to the court, again, Israel must stop its offensive on Rafah. Al Jazeera writes, the court was not convinced that Israel had taken sufficient measures to protect civilian life and voted 13 judges to 2 that Israel must take effective measures to enable any UN-backed commission of inquiry to enter Gaza and probe genocide allegations. And this is something that, again, they have very limited enforcement mechanisms to do. But it is a real sign that the international community, and this is something that really does not happen, and I think it's very important. I hate to say that I forget that I don't know if we covered this on the show. I believe we did on the last show, that Kareem Khan, the ICJ prosecutor, essentially said he was told by a top U.S. senator, which many people assume to be Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, that the ICJ is a court that only goes after Africans and Russian President Vladimir Putin, because they're supposed to go after people who the U.S. doesn't really care about. And those are the people who are unlucky enough to be on the opposite side of U.S. hegemony. So they're the people who are going to be the victims of, so to speak, and these are, by the way, all people who have done horrible crimes that are, on the dock at The Hague. But they are far from the only people who have done horrible crimes in this world. And it is very, very rare to see someone who is unequivocally on the side of U.S. interests, namely two people, Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu, who are on the side of U.S. interests, and the entire country of Israel itself, being scorned this way in a country that could not be closer to the U.S., the global superpower that, controls a lot of these institutions, whether we like it or not. It is very, very rare to see these institutions turn against Israel, which is, again, a just cornerstone of the U.S. empire. So that is why this is an unequivocally significant ruling. Just the institutions of global U.S. and quote unquote Western control are kind of turning on their leader here in the U.S., which is a pretty significant thing. But here, of course, is we have to be honest with the reality. Minutes after the ruling came, reports emerged of Israeli air raids in Rafah. For now, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not made a formal statement, but analysts believe that Israel will continue to violate the ICJ's order. Legal scholars and analysts have said that Israel refused compliance with earlier ICJ provisional measures on January 26. The ICJ has called on Israel to scale up aid and protect the rights of Palestinians under the Genocide Convention. Guramendi, who's the analyst here, that they quote for this article, added that new provisional measures compounds the pressure on Western states that arm Israel, which is a pretty interesting thing because now every time any Western country, including the United States, has this debate about whether or not to send weapons, which I think is, we're sending weapons. It's almost sad to say that. I think the debate, the time for debate in the United States has passed, and we just sent $14 billion more in weapons, and a $100 million weapon shipment of that $14 billion just went through relatively recently. So it's almost like this. It can be stopped. The U.S. government can essentially do anything it wants if the pressure is high enough. But every time now that we or any other Western country sends this money to or weapons or aid of any kind to Israel, we are really contributing to a genocide. We're getting on the wrong side of international justice, and that is something that again, a lot of this stuff is symbolic to a certain extent until it isn't. And I think, it's obvious and it's undeniable that the Palestinians need more than just, long-term, impactful, short-term symbolic, but it does in a real, I think, significant way continue to isolate the U.S. around the world and say this is stuff that, should not be allowed to stand. How can you justify selling weapons for Israel to use in Rafah? I don't think you can. I think it is legally impossible. So while this ICJ order won't stop the Operation Rafah itself, it builds pressure on the idea that it's okay to keep selling weapons to Israel. And again, any weapon shipment that goes out should be monitored, it should be exposed, and it should be made very, very clear that this is what these people are doing. This order is legally binding on Israel. Previous ICJ orders to scale up aid have already put states on notice that there is imminent risk of genocide, and therefore their duty under the Genocide Convention is to prevent that has already been triggered. This is Heidi Matthews, a legal scholar at York University from Toronto. Obviously, some folks will be disappointed there wasn't a full ceasefire order. This is still a big move, but it's not a full ceasefire move. Hamas welcomed the ICJ ruling. It said in a statement that Israel continues to commit massacres in the Gaza Strip, as we have seen quite clearly, especially now in Rafah in the wake of this ruling. And what they write is, what is happening in Jabalia and other governments of the Strip is no less criminal and dangerous than what is happening in Rafah. We call on the international community and the UN to pressure the occupation to immediately comply with this decision and seriously and genuinely proceed in translating all UN resolutions that force the Zionist occupation army to stop the genocide it has been committing against our people for more than 7 months. Bezalel Smotrich of the Israeli government wrote on X, he's saying that Israel was in a war for its existence and that, again, stopping a complete and total wipeout of the Palestinian people, in his eyes, is an attack on Israel's right to exist. He warned that stopping the assault meant the enemy will reach the beds of our children and women throughout the country. He then tweeted that history will judge those who stood by the Nazis of Hamas and ISIS. They have, again, UN really has no enforcement power here, essentially relying on members of the court to uphold their obligations under international law and the UN Security Council. Again, I think it's going to be very, very interesting because these states are going to all be upholding the laws to various different degrees. I think it's going to be a real test to see what happens if Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the House, invites Benjamin Netanyahu to speak at a joint session of Congress, as he has trying to do. Democrats are not thrilled with that because, it will look really bad because there most likely will be, by the time he gets out there, a warrant out for his arrest internationally. It'll limit definitely a lot of places. He's not going to be able to go to Germany, his best friends in Germany, because they have said they will enforce any warrant against him or his fellow government minister, Yoav Gallant. So, again, these are kind of limiting things. These are isolating things, and that does have a big deal. But make no mistake, there is absolutely more action, and pressure needs to be ramped up, especially on Joe Biden as he continues to send these weapons over. And again, I think the bottom line with him, it comes down to what I have been probably saying about this since January or February. It all fits into the quote of Anthony Blinken saying to that Israeli official, just give us a little more that we can tell our public to help you pull this thing off. Give us something here that we can spin and we can work with. They've had to ratchet up to the point where, they held on to, a few 3,000 weapons out of, 30,000 that have already been sent to Israel. And, that was only a pause, and they're just sending it, kind of under the table when no one's really paying attention. That is what they've had to ratchet things up to now to give to the base, because they, makes it look like they're doing something, because things on the other side have gotten so intense. It's not because of a desire of actually wanting to do anything. It's because they are trying to play a public relations game. Each side is trying to satisfy, of course, on the Israel side, the increasingly bloodthirsty base. Netanyahu is trying to satisfy his increasingly bloodthirsty anti-kind of American base. And Joe Biden is trying to satisfy his Democratic base, who is increasingly absolutely horrified. Majority of Democratic voters, Biden voters, think that this is a complete genocide. So he has a lot of satisfying to do on his end. And that is why you're seeing these kind of BS headlines of, I may have paused a little bit of aid. I may have asked the ship to hold off a little. It's all a bunch of BS. The weapons are flowing there, unadulterated, and it is exactly what Biden and his administration want to happen. That is the bottom line. Now, for our next story, it has been 2 years, I believe to the day, this past Friday, of the really horrific Uvalde shooting. The families of school children who were shot there at the Robb Elementary School in 2022 filed 2 lawsuits on Friday accusing Instagram, the publisher of the popular Call of Duty video game, and a manufacturer of semi-automatic rifles, of helping train and equip the teenage gunmen who committed the massacre. The unusual lawsuits were filed on the second anniversary of the elementary school shooting, in which 19 fourth graders and 2 teachers were killed in their classroom by an 18-year-old gunman who had purchased his weapon, an AR-15 style rifle, a few days before, as soon as he was legally able. This is here from the New York Times, David Goodman reporting. While much of the attention in the aftermath of the shooting has been on the flawed police response, I think that is one hell of an understatement from the New York Times. I mean, these are people who literally, there is no more purified expression of the absolute failure and just cowardliness, or whatever the hell the word is, and just uselessness of the police, and just absolute depravity of these police as they sat outside these classrooms as little kindergartners were gunned down and did nothing about it. Like there's the famous still shot of the cop scrolling on his cell phone in the hallway of a school, and the closed caption is, "The sound of children screaming has been removed from this video," as this gunman goes. And there's tens of cops outside the school. There's squad cars on squad cars. They're sitting there for hours letting this guy do this. I think it was up to an hour, more than an hour, before they finally came in and I think shot the guy. I don't even know. I don't think it was even the police that actually ended up shooting. It was unbelievable. And they stopped parents from getting in. They stopped parents from trying to save the kids. They essentially created a perimeter around the school for the guy to shoot as many kids as he wanted. And after that, not only the police chief hid out, did not resign, and the other members of the police department intimidated families who tried to do anything about it for years on end. So I dare say the flawed response is a pretty solid freaking understatement. Anyway, one filed in California, one in Texas, focused on the gunman and the companies that he regularly interacted with leading up to the shooting. Each company, the lawsuit claims, took part in grooming the teenager to become a mass shooter. I think, again, I think it's the Activision is the California one that's against the Call of Duty games and Instagram. feel like there is definitely something that could be gained from Call of Duty to a certain extent. I think the violent video games versus mass shooting link is, at least scientifically, is hazy at best. I think probably the much bigger thing would have been from the gun manufacturer and actually bringing the gun manufacturer in line, and as well as Instagram. He probably, who knows what awful stuff the Facebook for-profit algorithm was feeding him on Instagram. There's really some pretty unimaginably horrific stuff. But I think in the context of the police and the context of ours are just really awful and absolutely unimaginable legal system, it really, really is quite telling to see that it's almost the best that these parents can do to get any sort of justice for their kids. Like, they can't expect any law to be passed. Of course, they're going to have the shooter is going to be dealt with in a kind of a comprehensive way. They're going to be able to take care of the shooter, but there's nothing in place whatsoever from stopping this happening again. There's absolutely nothing in place, and it could happen again tomorrow in the next town over. And also, the police are essentially completely unpunished. That's another thing with this particular case that absolutely drives me crazy. And this is just another example of just how fundamentally broken our country is as a society. And it's just something that I think people don't, in America, it really is normalized. And I think it wouldn't really surprise people. It wouldn't really shock people, but I guess it shouldn't shock people. But I think it really did even surprise me when I spent the last 4 or 5 months out of the country, and all the people I talked to essentially said the number one thing that really freaks them out about America, one thing they cannot get about America, even if they come from dangerous areas in Europe or wherever, they cannot get the guns. It's just like it is mind-boggling. The school shootings, like that it's just no functioning society should be able to bear kids being gunned down en masse. And Sandy Hook, I think there was another recent anniversary for Sandy Hook. I know people who were affected by that, who lost their friends in that. And I feel like there's pretty much at this point nobody in America, especially who is in the Gen Z millennial age, that doesn't know anyone who has been impacted in some way by a shooting. I know people who lost friends in the Parkland shooting in 2018. It's just like and again, when we have a completely broken law enforcement system too, on top of this, and a legislative system that's incapable of mobilizing and stop these things from happening again, it's like we have a lot of problems in the country, but I think we are broken on another level when we are able to accept kids getting gunned down continuously in a way like this. And also, this whole law enforcement wrinkle is just another, and there's just this absolute, you can't, if you're, the personification of an anti-police, all cops are bastards type person, which, a lot of people on the left are, you could not make a better example of just the absolute cowardliness and the futility of the police in what the only real purpose that they're supposed to be there for. They failed in the most complete and utter way imaginable and did not face any punishment for it. So again, just two absolutely brain-breaking and really only deeply American facets of this here, and really an expression of just the really poor options for the families in trying to gain any sense of justice for the horrible crime that was committed to them 2 years ago. Okay, so this is an absolutely horrific story here out of Gaza in The Intercept. It's been 2 months, writes Kavitha Shekru in The Intercept. It's been 2 months since Osaid al-Ser has heard from his cousin Khaled al-Ser, a surgeon at Nasser Hospital in the southern Gaza Strip city of Khan Yunis. Before late March, they had been in regular contact, or as regular as the shredded communication infrastructure would allow. Al-Sayr had created a telemedicine WhatsApp group where he and Osaid, a surgical resident in the U.S., recruited doctors from stateside, the UK, and Europe to give advice to the overstretched colleagues in Gaza. He reported on a gunshot injury in a 70-year-old, Osaid said of Al-Sayr. It was in her head, and really there was no neurosurgeons at the time. He was sharing those cases, and he was asking for help, Osaid went on. It was like, is there any neurosurgeon that can help me? How can I fix this? It was just absolutely, unimaginable, this guy. Osaid talking about Al-Sayr, who was in Gaza at the time. Al-Sayr was a natural vessel for the collective medical knowledge of the group chat. He always wanted to help out. He always liked to use his hands to kind of fix a problem and have an immediate impact, according to Osaid. In February, the Israeli military invaded Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. The attack left the hospital hollowed out, just one of the destroyed healthcare system centers in a medical system savaged by an overwhelming caseload and a relentless Israeli military assault. Still, Al-Sayr maintained his optimism. His last post on Instagram was uploaded in mid-March, a short video showing the exterior of the hospital from the day before, captioned with a triumphant message. Finally, after more than a month of cutting electricity to Nasser Hospital, our staff was able to fix the generator and get electricity again to Nasser Hospital. For the last 2 weeks, we are trying to clean and prepare the hospital's departments to reopen the hospital again. 6 days later, on March 24th, Israeli forces stormed the hospital yet again. Osaid had asked a few days earlier if Al-Sayr was all right. No response ever came. It was their last exchange. His relatives believe that Khaled Al-Sayr, along with what was left of the hospital's dwindling staff, was taken prisoner by Israel. Again, doctors taken prisoner. It cannot be more depraved. It cannot be more of a clear attempt to cut these people off from any sort of intelligence, from any sort of resources that they may have, even from their their best and brightest, their doctors, their books, their libraries, their professors, their any sort of sense of humanity, any sort of sense of their ability to survive. It's just absolutely just demonic stuff. I'm sorry. It is really, really dark to even begin to think about. As early as November, reports emerged of doctors being detained going missing in North Gaza. According to the World Health Organization, at least 214 medical staff from Gaza have been detained by the Israeli military. Medical staff in early May, the detention and alleged torture of these staff made headlines when Israeli authorities announced the death of Aran Al-Bursh, a well-known surgeon and head of orthopedics at Al-Shifa Hospital. After being taken in custody in December, officials said Al-Bursh died in April while in Ofer prison, an Israeli detention facility in the occupied West Bank. Dr. Adan's case raises serious concerns that he died following torture in the hands of the Israeli authorities. His death demands an immediate independent investigation, said Teleng Mokfang, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, saying in his statement last week, the killing and detention of healthcare workers is not a legitimate method of warfare. They have a legitimate and essential role to care for sick and wounded persons during times of conflict. Al-Bursh is one of the at least 493 medical workers who've been killed, not just detained, by the way, killed in Gaza since October 7th, according to the Ministry of Health. The IDF has systematically targeted hospitals from the north to the south of the Strip, claiming that Hamas operates in these facilities with no evidence. Medical staff in Gaza's hospitals have repeatedly denied this claim. There has been no single person who has ever worked in a Gaza hospital of any nationality. There's been a lot of nationalities over the years that has in any way said anything to back up that claim. Medical staff, yet, that has not stopped the entire world from standing by as Israel has destroyed all of these hospitals. This week, Israeli forces have launched new attacks in Kamal Adwan Hospital and Al Adwa Hospital in the north, with reports of Wednesday and Thursday of medical staff being detained from Al Adwa. As ground troops made their way into southern Gaza, but at the end of the year, attacks on hospitals in the southern city of Khan Yunis ramped up. In February, when the Israeli military was laying siege to Nasser Hospital, Al-Sayr was the only general surgeon there. He's a very dedicated doctor, said Ahmad Moghrabi, a plastic surgeon who had previously worked at Nasser Hospital, said of Al-Sayr. Both doctors frequently post to social media about the horrific cases that are flooding into Nasser Hospital, especially as the attacks on the facility increased and international media coverage was scarce. I saw children, women torn into pieces, Moghrabi said, telling The Intercept, explaining why he began posting on social media. I wanted to show the world what was going on the ground. The last time he saw Al-Sir was in February. They, the Israeli military, surrounded the hospital and we were trapped, Mughrabi recalled. And the hospital came under siege for 3 weeks. We couldn't really move from one building to another. We couldn't have a look through the window. Otherwise, the snipers could shoot at us. Mughrabi left the hospital in mid-February during the first invasion. We evacuated at midnight that day. He said the IDF established a checkpoint not far from the hospital gate. They checked everybody, actually. My nurse, they took him at the checkpoint. He was detained for 2 months. As for Al-Sir, Osaid said his cousin left shortly after February evacuation to go to Rafah and check on his parents, but that he returned to Nasser Hospital to help reopen and treat patients. Since the attack on the hospital in late March, there's been hardly any news of Al-Sir. The only crumbs of information have been more alarming than reassuring. The first is that Al-Sir was last seen signed into his WhatsApp in mid-April. He was last active online on April 12th, which to me tells me that they confiscated his phone and they basically accessed his phone as well. Then, a few days later, on April 17th, the news outlet Al Mayadeen released an interview with a Palestinian who identified himself as Ahmed Abu Akel and said he'd been detained and released by Israel. Mughrabi told The Intercept that Abu Akel was previously a nurse at Nasser Hospital. Clothed in the gray sweatshirt and sweatpants, a common outfit for released Palestinian detainees, Abu Akel said that he had a message from the doctors of Nasser Hospital who were being held in detention. They are subject to daily beatings and killings and torture, said Abu Akel. There is a message in particular from the Dr. Nahed Abu Taima, director of surgery at Nasser Medical Complex. His situation is very different, and he is suffering under very difficult, tragic circumstances. He needs treatment and needs to be seen by the Red Cross and released urgently. A colleague of mine was being held next to me, Abu Akel said. His name was Khaled. They plucked his entire beard with pliers in front of me. His beard was plucked. This is one of the hundreds I know. Osaid believes he was referring to Khaled Al-Sir. While Abu Akel did not say where he was held, where Al-Sir may still be, Osaid thinks it's likely Sidi Temen, a military base and detention center in Israel's Negev desert, which has been exposed by outlets as, quote-unquote reputable, as mainstream as CNN, as essentially a concentration camp. Abuse, torture, detainees dying at Sidi Temen. The Israeli military did not respond again to requests for comment. Aside from Abu Akel's vague testimony and the one blip on WhatsApp, there has been no information or updates on Al-Sir's whereabouts or conditions. It's just heartbreaking to know nothing about your loved ones, said, we do not know if he is alive or not. We do not know if he is okay or not. And we have seen a little bit from the releases of Palestinian prisoners, and it has been really bad from what we've heard. In December, Khaled Hamouda, another surgeon who has been working in Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza. In a month earlier, he had been displaced from the Indonesian hospital where he normally practiced. At Kamal Adwan, Hamouda was a patient receiving treatment for injuries he sustained in an airstrike on his family home in Beit Lahia. His wife, daughter, father, and a brother, among relatives, were killed in the attack. It was about 10 days after the strike when Israeli forces ordered both medical staff and civilians sheltering at Kamal Adwan Hospital to leave. Hamouda told the hospital administration was told that people would be able to leave and go to a different hospital without being arrested. But of course, that's not what happened. Hamouda and some of his colleagues were taken into custody by the Israeli military. When they attacked the hospital, they asked all the men and youth older than 15 and younger than 55 to hold their ID and get out from the hospital. Hamouda said their eyes were covered, their hands bound. They were taken to another location, though Hamouda is still not sure where. And there's pictures of them that have come out. It's, again, really unimaginable stuff. And you see here really, quote-unquote, victory photos just of men who are gathered out, huddling in, all uniform clothes in just a pile of rubble, guarded by Israeli soldiers. It is really, really scary stuff. And these seem to be some of these men. Images spread on social media on these dozens of detainees being held in northern Gaza. In one photo, a group of men stand shirtless in the foreground as a soldier appears to take their photo. It wasn't long before people were able to identify one of the men as Hamouda. Hamouda said he was eventually taken to Sidi Temen, where he and other detainees were forced to remain on their knees. If they didn't, they were punished. They asked him to stand with his hand above his head for 3 to 4 hours, he said of one of the prisoners, which is a well-known, really Israeli specialty method of torture. Unfortunately, when they knew that I'm a doctor and a general surgeon, they treated me more badly. They attacked me and they beat me in my back and in my head. Hamuda said the soldiers wanted to know if he knew about Israelis held captive in Gaza, but obviously he didn't know anything. While he was detained, he also saw someone he knew from the medical community, Dr. Adnan al-Bursh. They brought Dr. Adnan in at around 2 or 3 a.m. He was horribly treated. He was in pain, Hamuda said. He told me, Khaled, they beat me. They attacked me violently. According to Hamuda, al-Bursh said that he had a fractured rib. Hamuda was able to procure medicine and some food for al-Bursh, but 2 days later, the injured doctor was taken away. Despite his condition and the harsh circumstances of his prison, al-Bursh brought news for Hamuda. Your mother is present in Al-Huda hospital. She is fine. I treated her. Hamuda recalled al-Bursh telling him. Hamuda was very grateful for the message. The information was very, very precious for me because I didn't know any information about my family, specifically my mother. So I hugged and kissed him in his head and thanked him because it is the only hope that when I get out, I will find her. After 3 weeks, Hamuda was released. He told The Intercept that he and other detainees were driven to the Kerem Shalom border crossing in the south and eventually went to Rafah. His surviving children and mother were still in the north, and it would be 2 months before they are able to reunite. He still considers himself fortunate because he was released. All my colleagues, doctors who were arrested with me or after me, before me, they kept them for about 3 or 4 or 5 months. Some are still being held. Even before the war, doctors were crucial in Gaza amid the ebbs and flows of Israeli border restrictions and military attacks. Every 2 to 3 years, Hamuda said, we become trapped in some war or some attack from the Israeli army, so our work is so important for the people who are present there. Hamuda's father had been a doctor, and wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. He advised me to be a doctor, Hamuda said, because it's a benefit to people. Fulfilling the necessity of care for people, Hamuda believes, is why healthcare workers have become such common targets in this war. It's not a coincidence, he said. They mean to attack the houses of people who can treat the wounded people, and that can change something in the condition in the north. Sentiments were shared by Osaid, who said his cousin Al-Ser would have agreed. They became doctors to help people. With the amount of killing that's been going on for a while, we're always in need for surgeons to fix traumatic injuries that people sustain, Osaid said. And so to me, it was a natural response growing up in Gaza, the desire of helping out and healing injured people. And he finishes by saying of his cousin Al-Ser, I just hope he's okay. And unimaginable stuff in a really depraved attack on some of the most precious elements of any society. Whether it be doctors, children, journalists, what have you, just the parts of society that make a culture, a people, have just been ruthlessly and gleefully attacked by the Israeli states. All right, so here's a pretty interesting one for you. We have this in the Jacobin magazine, Branko Marcetic. So, again, we have had some kind of more interesting reporting coming out after this over time. But he writes the headline, and it's a pretty good one. It really, really looks like Saudi Arabia did 9/11. And he starts by writing, it's never a bad time to reflect on the copious evidence for the Saudi government's role in facilitating the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. In fact, it's arguably important more than ever right now, with the Biden administration seemingly dead set on signing a mutual defense pact with the same government, a pact that would legally oblige the United States to get dragged into another Middle Eastern war by fighting alongside Saudi Arabia if and when it comes under attack. And if you thought Israel was a bad country to ally yourself with, again, to be fair, Saudi Arabia isn't really actively committing a genocide at the moment. You could say they were doing it against the Yemenis with their really awful targeting of civilians and continuous blockade that we completely assisted until very recently, until the Chinese actually stopped us and made a peace deal. But they are a really, really awful country, Saudi Arabia. It's important to say. First reported by the Florida Bulldog, the latest revelations come from a mid-court filing that has come out of the ongoing lawsuit that 9/11 victims' families launched against the Saudi government, challenging the kingdom's attempt to have the suit dismissed. Littered through the filings are copious references to never-before-seen evidence collected by the family's lawyers in the process of discovery, included in the material declassified by President Joe Biden in September 2021, which they argue without a shadow of a doubt that the Saudi government played an integral and deliberate role helping the 9/11 hijackers kill nearly 3,000 Americans. One piece of evidence mentioned in the video is found by authorities in the apartment of Saudi national Omar al-Bayoumi after they raided it shortly after the attacks. Al-Bayoumi was not simply an asset of the General Intelligence Presidency, Saudi Arabia's principal spy agency, as damning as that is alone. According to a 2017 FBI report declassified 2 years ago, he was paid his monthly GIP stipend through and reported his intelligence gathering to the then Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar Sultan Al Saud. I think they called him Prince Bandar Bush or something because, of course, and this is where your third eye can really start to open here. He was a well-connected, long-serving official who was friends with, among others, the Bush family. According to the filing, the tape, which police produced just days before the document was filed, shows al-Bayoumi driving around Washington, D.C. with two Saudi embassy officials who the FBI determined had a nexus to al-Qaeda, in which he surveys the U.S. Capitol at length, noting structural features, entrances, and security posts, and making remarks throughout reflecting hostility to the West and Congress, including senators who make all the decisions. As the filing states, the U.S. Capitol was among the targets the hijackers had discussed hitting and may have well been the intended target of Flight 93 before a passenger uprising made it crash in Pennsylvania. Another piece of evidence gathered from al-Bayoumi's apartment, a drawing of a plane alongside an equation and calculations that were meant to discern a distance at which a target on the ground will be visible from a certain altitude as determined by an aviation expert. The 9/11 hijackers would needed to know from what distances and altitudes they would be able to see their target, and this information gave them the visual cues needed to fly the hijacked jetliners into the targets. The filing quotes the expert as saying, meanwhile, the filing states the equation on the drawing has nothing to do with what leader al-Bayoumi claimed it was for. After the fact, in a later deposition, that the drawing was merely about measuring the distance between two different cities. In the 2017 report, the FBI concluded there's a 50-50 chance al-Bayoumi had advanced knowledge the 9/11 attacks would occur. But these two pieces of evidence alone make that one of the century's great understatements. If al-Bayoumi had possible foreknowledge about the 9/11 attacks, it's because he was intimately involved in planning them. Meanwhile, phone records cited in the filing show back-and-forth calls between al-Bayoumi and the Saudi embassy, consulate, and various officials at key points before the arrival of two of the hijackers in L.A. between and prior to directly following key events of logistic assistance provided to the hijackers, and before and after the party al-Bayoumi held for the hijackers, connecting them to a local support network. So pretty much every major step of the way, al-Bayoumi was supervising these hijackers and reporting it all back to the Saudi embassy, the head of which was a very, very close friend of not just the Crown Prince, but the Bush administration. Other phone records show al-Bayoumi and Saudi consular official Fahad al-Tumairi calling Ismail Mana, another official with the Saudi Ministry of Islamic Affairs, who has long been accused of being a vehicle for the spread of extremism. Shortly before he met with the hijackers, he placed calls for the purpose of finding the hijackers an apartment before they arrived. In fact, al-Bayoumi had visited the rental office of his own apartment complex at least 5 times before their arrival, asking if there was an apartment available in close proximity to his, according to evidence gathered in the discovery. And it really gets interestingly into the very close relationship between this figure, Ismail Mana, who was known to the FBI as someone who was spreading extremism left, right, and center, and this King Fahad Mosque that Mana helped oversee as part of his work for the Saudi government. A mosque initially that Saudi Arabia had funded, the FBI concluded, had been a site of extremist-related activity before and after September 11th. He testified that he had a fierce hatred of non-Muslims and anti-American beliefs, according to this deposition. The big question right now, though, is why on earth would Americans ever want to bind themselves to fight and die on behalf of a government that did this as the Biden administration wants? Again, this is really important here because this, again and again, not only, This is probably, to be honest, one of the worst, at least recent crimes Saudi Arabia has done with, again, some very interesting ties all throughout between the Bush family and the incredible closeness, because essentially, the Bush family was for a very long time an influential oil family, and so was the Saudi, many members of the House of Saud. And that is, it's a big thing that I think at the very least is worth exploring. But the much, much more important thing in this situation is Biden, the supposed moderate candidate here that we're all supposed to, vote for because he has the more reasonable plan for Middle East peace, among other things relative to Trump. His big plan is to bind us with Israel, the people who have committed a genocide, and with Saudi Arabia, the people who did motherfucking 9/11. Like, this is who he wants to put us up with. He wants to have us lock hands with MBS and Benjamin Netanyahu as a way to sing Kumbaya, kick out the Palestinians, and, tie American military to the fate of Saudi Arabia forever. It's absolutely, and by the way, in writing, because it was already essentially de facto, but put it in writing. Like, this is somebody who's a supposedly moderate, reasonable person. It's an absolute joke. It's an absolute joke. And another, damning indictment that Biden is, most likely too senile to stop Brett McGurk from kissing up to Saudi Arabia, which is, again, another really, really, talk about, demonic country. And again, I don't want to be accused of singling out Israel as a very bad country, because, they are, and they're doing really a horrific crime against humanity right now every single day. But, damn well we're not going to stop it by butting up with Saudi Arabia. That is for sure. Again, who did 9/11. Cannot be overstated enough. All right. That's all we got for you guys today. It's Newsflash.